How to apply for Canadian citizenship. Today we're talking about Canadian citizenship process, and I have Cory Weber, regulated Canadian immigration consultant, here to help us understand how the process looks like and how you can apply for Canadian citizenship. My name is Olena Weber and I'm RCIC, so let's get into it. Cory, let's start from the basics. Can you tell me what is the eligibility requirements that somebody would need to meet to apply for Canadian citizenship?
So the first and foremost thing is obviously you need to be a permanent resident of Canada already. So that means obviously you can't move from work permit status or study permit into citizenship. You need to first get your permanent residence. That's step one. Step two is you need to meet what's called the physical presence. So that's the most important, eligibility factor. And it's kind of confusing for people, but basically you have to have a period of time in Canada as a permanent resident to be eligible for that citizenship. So different people have different circumstances, and I will get into that. I think into like the specifics of the physical presence because it is a bit complicated, and in some cases it can be complicated. So yeah, we'll get into that. But basically, yeah, you need to be a permanent resident, and you need to have a certain amount of days physical presence in Canada to be eligible to apply.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about physical presence because I feel like that's where everybody gets confused. So, what's the difference for applying Canadian citizenship for a person who hasn't been living in Canada previously on a work permit or student study permit or anything like that, and then the person, for example, who has been living like previously on a study or work permit? Because usually that's kind of like what we deal with those two types of cases. So the first type is essentially when the person came to Canada, like worked here for a while and then transitioned to PR and then applying for citizenship. And then the other type is when the person just landed in Canada as a permanent resident and started living in Canada as a PR already. So what's the difference there?
Yeah. So let's talk about like the simpler case, which would be if you landed in Canada as a permanent resident and you had no, temporary residence in Canada before your PR. So your PR clock starts counting the day you get to Canada. Now, the rule is you need 1,095 days physically present in Canada as a permanent resident. So in this case, it's quite easy to calculate. The day you landed in Canada, your clock starts ticking. And now you need to get to that magical 1,095 days. Keeping in mind, physical presence, that every day outside of Canada does not count towards that 1,095. So you take a week vacation to Cuba or you go back home to visit family, whatever it may be, that reduces the number. So you have to make up for those vacations. So basically, that's the simplest form to think about. Now, it gets complicated for those who had temporary residence. And so, for example, if you came to Canada on a visitor or a study permit or a work permit, you can still count some of those days as your temporary residence to a maximum of 365. But the catch here, which makes it all complicated, that you're only allowed for every one day you're here as a temporary resident, it qualifies for half a day towards your 1,095, up to a maximum of 365 days total. So basically, if we put it in layman's terms, if you were here for 2 years as a temporary resident, either a worker, a student, or a visitor, then those 2 years would count as 1 year of your physical presence made up because half day is, so you need 1 year, it equals 2 years, basically. So yeah, then you only need 720 days, 730, sorry, days to make up to get to your 1,095. So temporary residence is a maximum of 365 days. Add that to your permanent residence time after becoming a PR. I know it's very complicated, but basically, yeah, the rule of thumb is you can use a maximum of 365 days of temporary residence. That's it. The rest has to be made up by permanent residence time. So you still need 2 years in Canada as a permanent resident, but you can claim 1 year of temporary residence to go
Yeah,
towards that.
that makes sense for
It
sure.
makes sense? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I know it's complicated.
I know it's really difficult to explain that because also a lot of people do have like extended vacations, especially with, post COVID remote work became
Yeah,
more common. So a lot of people would just like go back home, live there for three,
exactly.
6 months. They would work remotely. So it does become like really complicated.
That is what makes it like even more complicated is when you have like a, let's say you became a permanent resident, but you were here temporarily before you became a PR. The day you get PR, you leave Canada, you go home for 1 year, then you say, okay, I want to come back to Canada after 2 or 3 years, let's say, and work to getting my citizenship. But the clock has shifted now. It's extremely hard to explain, but you have to use the online physical calculator, really, is the only way to do it. But basically, like, you're losing the back end of your days. Your 365 days as temporary residents are slowly disappearing as you're outside of the country, right? You can't use those days because it's a 5 year period for your citizenship. It's exceedingly complicated when those circumstances happen, but there is a trick to it, and it's called the online physical presence calculator. It's your best friend. You put your information in there, and it'll spit out a number at the end of the day, and you can understand like when you can apply for citizenship. So that's what we use in our calculations, and we recommend people do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say I'm eligible and everything works out and I calculated my days and everything makes sense. So I'm ready to apply. So which documents do I need to prepare to apply?
Yeah. So obviously you need, your identity documents, your passport's not actually required. We do include it, but your PR card is required. You need proof of if you're using temporary residence, you need proof of those temporary documents that you had, study permits, work permits, whatever it may be. You need identity documents in terms of like either driver's license. You can use your PR card as one. You can use a driver's license, health card. If you have been outside of the country for more than I think, what is it, 84 days, I believe, in the past 5 years, you actually have to provide a police certificate as well. So that's another thing that to keep in mind. People forget that one. Other than that, you need to, your normal documents, just like there's not much to the actual application. It's more about like correctly putting the information in and, keeping in mind, you probably applied for PR within the past, 5 years, that everything should be matching that, right? So your
Yeah,
applications.
that's a very good point because
Yeah.
the consistency, that's what people forget. Because even when we help our clients with citizenship applications and we request all the information about like their employment, their address history, we always try to make sure that that was that is consistent with their PR application, just because you cannot really have two contradictory applications because clearly one of them is probably wrong, and like if
Exactly.
information is just not matching, that causes IRCC those red flags. And I've actually seen citizenship interviews. I've seen when people were called for interviews when they would be asking questions literally about those not matching information, why your employment, especially when it concerns employment. I've seen that when employment is not matching, and especially if that employment was part of the eligibility for PR,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? So all sort of things can happen. So it's really important to fill out that application properly.
Absolutely.
Um,
Another one I wanted to bring up, which is very important and people need to consider when they're thinking about applying, is the travel history and just your personal travel history that you did, because that is going to be used to calculate that physical presence. So, whether or not you have that information, you need to provide it in a very clear manner and a very like you have to be thorough with it. You can't be like, oh, I think I was on vacation here or there. No, you need to be like spot on with your vacation. That's how the 1,095 days is being calculated based on how many vacations you took, or if you were outside of the country for 1 day or 2 day, you crossed the border even, all of that needs to be recorded. So if you're a permanent resident right now watching this, consider getting a pen and paper out and start tracking your trips, right? If you haven't already, and keep like a travel history going, just so that it's easier for you when you are doing the physical presence calculations, that you have all that information easily readable.
Yes, exactly. That is a challenge for a lot of clients that are traveling a lot. And that's the thing, is that you cannot really be guessing or second guessing.
Exactly.
because IRCC checks that. And if something doesn't match, because they do have access to some of your travel information, not all, but some of the travel, because when you fly out of the airport, they would like internally have access to that. And if it doesn't match, then that not only causes delays to your application, but it actually can lead to an interview and to further just investigation of your travel history, because they need to really make sure that your residency is eligible for Canadian citizenship and that the dates are making sense. All right. So once I apply for Canadian citizenship, then what happens? What are the steps after the application is submitted?
Yeah. So generally, the first step would be your citizenship test. So that's the big one everyone gets really scared of, because it's a test and you got to answer the questions about Canadian history and just about all general Canadian topics. And so people get terrified of it, thinking like it's going to be very difficult. And there's a guide which you read, which is the Canadian Guide online. You can read that. That's your preparation for the test. And when you read it, it is a lot of information in there and obscure names and dates, and people get terrified and think like they're going to get grilled on which date they signed the declaration, all these crazy dates. The answer to that, and people, when I talk to them, I say they're not trying to get you to fail. Like, they want you to become Canadian, but they want to make sure you have some kind of knowledge on, the history and the culture of Canada. So they're not out there trying to make you fail. And some of the questions are quite, simple, like what colors are on the flag of Canada? Hopefully you know that. So that's the first step, would be doing this citizenship test. You need to get 15 out of 20 questions correct to pass. Most people are able to do that. So that's step one. Once that's done, usually, generally, there's a big period of waiting. There could be requests at this point, perhaps for fingerprinting, which we've seen. And, if there's any other requests or, information, they might do it at that point. Fingerprinting is generally used if your name is matching someone else who has maybe a criminal past or something like that, generally is what we see. Then after that, after some period of time, you will be issued the oath. Basically, there's not much to it. Like, you just get scheduled for your oath. And right now you can have online oath, like online ceremony, or in person. Most are online these days. Usually, like, if it's a family, they try to do like an in-person ceremony. But yeah, that's it. Like, it's really pretty straightforward application. Like, after your citizenship test, it's straight, waiting, and then your oath comes through. That's it. And once you do your ceremony, you cut up your PR card. You do the ceremony, whether it's online or in person, and you get your certificate of Canadian citizenship, and then you can then apply for a Canadian passport. So that's basically the process.
Yeah, perfect. And the last question. So, what happens if, let's just say, I do a Canadian citizenship application, but I, didn't include some document, or maybe I included some wrong information, or I missed something? Like, what the outcomes if I make a mistake?
Yeah, so normally, that would be a request. It depends on what it is. Like, you could have an application returned to you. Most times we see that that's what happens, is someone's is just returned. You're missing a document. It's an incomplete application. Most of the time, they're pretty generous, and they will give you a chance to then upload that document. They will point to which mistake you might have made, and your application is not necessarily closed and returned, but it is returned to you to correct your mistake. We do see that. It's very rare that they would just return an application outright, but it could happen. Of course, it depends on the severity of your mistake, I would guess. But if you're just missing, like, for example, one document was like, you're supposed to do front and back, you only did the front, they could request that of you. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Because for PR, for example, that's very different, because PR applications are like, they're not generous at all. Like, they're trying to fail you. Like, they're outright returning and hoping that you will never apply again.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a difference, right, between Canadian citizenship, because that you're already a permanent resident, so there is some leeway, I suppose, that they give you. Whereas, yeah, permanent residents, definitely, like, they're not taking any mistakes at all, and your application will be absolutely returned to you. There's Citizenship is a much less stressful process. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's exactly the perfect phrasing. Citizenship is definitely a less stressful process. It's just, I think that like the biggest challenge of the citizenship is the calculation of those days, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've had some nightmare scenarios with clients, like, just trying, like, imagine, like, a person with just, a huge amount of vacation periods, complicated history about, like, temporary residents leaving Canada for, long periods of time, then coming back. yeah, like it can be a nightmare to figure it out, but you know, at the end of the day, you can do it. It's just like keep your records clean, I guess I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really loved having this conversation with you. And I hope our viewers have now a little bit more knowledge on how the process actually looks like. Don't forget to please subscribe to our channel. We're a small, growing channel, and we would love to have you as our subscriber. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.